The grand archival hall stretched across the polished black floors like a massive cathedral of knowledge, and its walls held memories of 10,000 different worlds that had risen and fallen across the galaxy, like waves on an endless ocean. And historian Velkthor stood before the assembled Galactic Council with his 6 eyes showing something close to what humans might call fear, or perhaps respect mixed with caution, because what he was about to reveal would change how every species in the room thought about the newcomers from that small blue world orbiting an average yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. The delegates sat in their designated areas arranged by age of civilization, with the oldest near the center, and the youngest toward the edges, and humanity's seat remained empty because they had not yet been formally invited to this particular session, and that was intentional, because today the council would decide what humanity truly represented to the greater galactic community, and whether they should be welcomed or watched or perhaps feared. Velkthor activated the display, and a blue-green planet appeared floating in the center of the chamber, rotating slowly to show its oceans and continents and cloud patterns, and to most observers it looked peaceful and beautiful, and entirely unremarkable among the billions of inhabited worlds scattered across known space. But Velkthor knew better, because he had spent 30 years studying the species that called this world home, and what he had learned kept him awake through many cycles. The assembled delegates waited in silence as Velkthor began his presentation with a simple statement that would set the tone for everything that followed, and his translator device hummed softly as it converted his native language into the common tongue used by all council members. And he said that humanity was granted immediate council status upon first contact, and this fact alone should tell them something important, because never in the history of the Galactic Council had a species barely 2 centuries into space travel been given such an honor. The council speaker leaned forward with interest evident in his crystalline body language and asked the obvious question of why such a young species deserved such recognition. And Velkthor's response was to show them what his research teams had discovered during their decades of observation, starting from the moment humanity first split the atom and turned it into a weapon before they had even left their own atmosphere. The display shifted to show grainy footage from Earth's surface dated to what humans called the year 1945, and it showed a city transformed into ash and fire in an instant, and then another city suffering the same fate days later. And the delegates watched in uncomfortable silence, because most civilizations took centuries or even millennia to develop such destructive capability. But humanity had done it, within decades of understanding atomic structure, and they had used it not against an alien threat but against themselves. Velkthor explained that his people had classified humanity as a Category 4 emerging threat and placed them under observation protocols, because every species that weaponized atomic energy before achieving planetary unity had always destroyed themselves without exception, and the pattern was so reliable that it was considered a universal constant like gravity or the speed of light. But humanity proved to be different in ways that the observers found deeply disturbing. The footage showed the decades that followed, with humanity building enough nuclear weapons to destroy their world dozens of times over and aiming those weapons at each other in what they called a Cold War, and the observers had waited for the inevitable extinction event that would erase this troublesome species from the cosmos, but it never came, and instead, humanity kept pulling back from the brink again and again, as if they were aware of how close they stood to oblivion. Then Velkthor showed them something that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats, and it was footage of humans strapping themselves to controlled explosions and throwing themselves into space using nothing but mathematics and determination, because they wanted to prove something to each other. And within 66 years of their first powered flight, they had walked on their moon using technology so primitive it seemed impossible that it worked at all. The display showed the lunar surface with a human in a bulky white suit planting a flag and taking those famous first steps, and Velkthor pointed out that this achievement came while humanity was still divided into over 200 competing nations, and while they still had thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other, ready to fire at a moment's notice, and this combination of cooperation and conflict existing simultaneously was something the observers had never seen before. But what truly caught the attention of Velkthor's research team was what happened next, and the display shifted to show small spacecraft leaving Earth's orbit carrying golden records with messages, and music and images showing humanity's location in the galaxy, for anyone who might find them. And Velkthor asked the council to consider what kind of species would announce their presence and location to an unknown galaxy, while barely understanding the dangers that lurked in the dark between stars. The answer was either a species of fools or a species so confident in their ability to handle threats that they feared nothing, and the observers had assumed the former until they witnessed what came to be known as the Morrison Incident. And Velkthor pulled up footage of a small human exploration vessel called Unity, traveling through unclaimed space on a routine mapping mission in what humans called the year 2187. Commander Jake Morrison was 32 years old and in charge of a crew of 12 scientists and engineers who were studying stellar phenomena when they encountered something that made experienced galactic observers freeze in terror, and it was a Krell hunter-killer probe drifting through the void looking for new species to evaluate for conquest or elimination. The Krell had been one of the great terrors of the outer sectors before their containment, and their probes were designed to be unstoppable, and they had encountered thousands of species across millions of years, and none had survived initial contact except by fleeing immediately and hoping the probe didn't follow. But Commander Morrison made a different choice. The footage showed the probe opening, fire on the Unity, and the ship's primitive shields collapsed within seconds, and any rational being would have fled immediately while transmitting all data back home to warn their people. But Morrison looked at his crew, and they looked back at him, and someone said that if the probe followed them home, it might find Earth and everyone they loved would die. So Morrison made a decision that would eventually bring humanity to the attention of the entire Galactic Council, and he ordered his engineer to give him maximum power to the engines, and he pointed his ship directly at the probe, and he activated the emergency beacon so someone would know what they had done and why they had done it, and then he rammed his vessel into the Krell probe at maximum velocity. The collision was silent in the vacuum of space, but both vessels became expanding clouds of debris and wreckage, and all 12 humans died instantly. But the probe's black box survived, and when galactic recovery teams found it, they accessed its final threat assessment, and it had classified humanity as extreme threat level, with a recommendation to avoid at all costs, because the species exhibited suicidal aggression when defending territory or pack members. Velkthor let that information settle over the council chamber before he continued, and he pointed out that in 4,000 previous encounters, the Krell probe had never recommended avoidance, and it had destroyed entire civilizations and harvested thousands of species, but 12 humans in a science vessel with no weapons made it decide that humanity was too dangerous to engage. That was when the Galactic Council truly began paying attention to the species from Earth, and that was when Velkthor began to understand that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic history, and that was when the fear began. The council chamber filled with nervous energy as delegates discussed what they had learned, and Velkthor stood patiently waiting, because he knew the most important revelations were still to come, and his assistant approached with another data crystal, this one pulsing with recent events that would show the council what happened when humanity actually encountered galactic civilization. The council speaker raised a crystalline appendage and asked about the current status of human relations with the galaxy, because historical data was interesting, but present reality was what mattered for policy decisions, and Velkthor had been dreading this question because the answer would make several delegates very uncomfortable. He explained that 3 years ago, a human exploration vessel called Magellan made unauthorized entry into Sector 49J, which was quarantine space sealed off for very good reasons, and several delegates stiffened because they knew what that sector contained, and it was the dead world of Karmanos, where an ancient civilization had destroyed itself in a biological war 2,000 years earlier. The planet was contaminated with 12 different doomsday pathogens, and each one was capable of extinction-level events if released, and galactic warning buoys surrounded the sector in all major languages, and the humans couldn't have missed them. And a delegate asked whether humanity had simply ignored quarantine protocols. Velkthor said not exactly, and explained that Captain Ryan Martinez received the warnings and understood them perfectly, but his vessel had detected something on the surface that changed everything, and the display showed scanning data, revealing a faint power signature that was rhythmic and clearly artificial, and someone was alive down there broadcasting a distress signal on ancient frequencies. The signal was 1800 years old and repeating on automatic systems, but the power source was still active, and a Velnari delegate said this was impossible because nothing could survive on that world. But Velkthor said the humans had the same reaction. Yet Captain Martinez made a decision to go down there anyway. The footage showed 3 humans in bulky environmental suits, walking through ruins of an alien city with toxic dust swirling around them, and Velkthor identified them as Dr. Helen Brooks, the xenobiologist, and Lieutenant Kevin Ross for security, and Captain Martinez. And these 3 people were entering a world that had killed billions. They moved through collapsed buildings until they found the source of the signal, and it was a bunker sealed and shielded with its emergency power finally failing after 2 millennia. And inside they found 23 Carminos in stasis pods, and they were children and civilians hidden away as a last desperate measure during the final war. The council watched as the humans checked each pod, and most were dark with their occupants long dead, but 5 still showed life signs. And Velkthor said quietly that they had found 5 survivors from a species the galaxy had classified as extinct. Captain Martinez's voice came through the recording, asking for immediate medical support and containment protocols because they had living Carminos, and the response from his ship was negative because Galactic Council had clear protocols, and quarantine must be maintained, and they were ordered to leave the survivors and extract immediately. The recording showed 20 seconds of silence before Martinez asked whether they were really being ordered to leave survivors behind, and his ship confirmed that protocols were clear, and any breach of Carminos containment risked a galactic pandemic. Martinez looked at his 2 companions, and Dr. Brooks nodded, and Lieutenant Kevin Ross checked his weapon, then holstered it, and Martinez said they were revising that order and bringing the survivors up regardless of protocols. His ship warned him that he would be violating galactic law and that Earth would be quarantined and possibly blockaded, and Martinez began disconnecting the first stasis pod from its power supply while saying that Earth would have company in quarantine then because he wasn't leaving children in coffins when they could help. Velkthor paused the recording and said that Captain Martinez had full knowledge of the consequences, and he understood his actions would likely result in humanity's isolation from galactic civilization before they had even properly joined it, but he did it anyway. The recording resumed, showing the difficult process of moving stasis pods through toxic ruins to the landing ship, and then the tense hours as Magellan raced toward the quarantine boundary with every galactic patrol vessel in the sector converging on their position. Captain Martinez was intercepted 16 hours later, and his vessel was surrounded by 42 council ships, and he was ordered to surrender the Carminos survivors or be destroyed. And then something happened that the observers didn't anticipate. New vessels appeared on scanners, and they were human ships coming from every direction, and there were civilian vessels and military escorts and even colony transports, and hundreds of them, and Velkthor said humanity heard what Captain Martinez had done, and they heard the Council's ultimatum, and they came even though they had no military capable of standing against Council forces. A transmission played, and a human woman named Commander Laura Hayes said the human fleet would not abandon Captain Martinez or the survivors he rescued, and if the Council fired on Magellan, they would be firing on all of them. A Krell delegate said they must have been bluffing, but Velkthor said the Council thought so too, and they analyzed the human formation and their weapons and their shields and calculated they could destroy the entire human fleet in under an hour, and they told the humans. This Commander Hayes responded immediately, saying, "Then you'll have to destroy us because we're not moving." And Velkthor explained that 317 human vessels with crew complements averaging 70 people meant 22,000 humans willing to die for 5 aliens they had never met from a species extinct for 2,000 years. The standoff lasted 6 hours with no shots fired, and instead the Council went into emergency session because they had 3 options, and those were to destroy the human fleet and ensure humanity would be their eternal enemy, or abandon containment protocols maintained for millennia, or find a third way. The display showed the compromise reached, and it was a joint research station with the Carminos survivors in specialized medical facilities and human and galactic scientists working together under unprecedented containment measures. Velkthor said it took 2 years of intensive work, but Dr. Brooks and her team, working with the finest xenobiologists in the galaxy, developed A treatment protocol and the Carmenos survivors were cured, and their world's contamination was slowly being cleaned, and humanity earned something never granted to such a young species. The official document appeared showing full council membership, with emergency ratification, and Captain Martinez and Dr. Brooks received the council's highest civilian honors, though Lieutenant Ross declined his award, saying he was just doing his job. But Velkthor said that wasn't why the council was terrified of humanity, and the display showed human ships spreading across previously quarantined sectors and into hazardous regions marked as no-go zones for millennia. He said simply that humans started looking for more and more survivors and more forgotten species and more quarantined worlds that might harbor life the council had written off as lost, and they kept finding. Them species profiles began appearing, and there was the crystalline Veshtar thought extinct for 5,000 years and found in a failing generation ship, and the aquatic Mirshal surviving in a single sealed cavern on their dead world, and the hive mind Thren reduced to a single colony in stasis beneath a collapsed city. Velkthor said that in 3 years, humans had rediscovered 17 species classified as extinct and provided asylum to 46 refugee populations. The council couldn't help and entered 19 different quarantine zones and emerged successfully every time. The delegates sat in stunned silence as Velkthor explained that humans didn't see quarantine zones as boundaries, but as places where people needed help, and they didn't see acceptable losses as acceptable, and they saw problems that needed solving, and most importantly, they never gave up. A young delegate asked whether Velkthor was saying humanity was a threat because they were too helpful, and all 6 of his eyes focused on the speaker, as he said he was saying humanity was a threat because they made the council remember what they used to be before they became comfortable and cautious, and before they started calculating acceptable losses and writing off species as extinct without checking if anyone was still alive. He turned back to the council and said that every species humanity saved, and every refugee population they sheltered, and every impossible rescue they completed asked the same question, and that was, why didn't the council do this? And why did they accept that some species were beyond saving? And when did they decide protocols were more important than lives? Velkthor pulled up one final image showing Captain Martinez standing with the 5 Carmenos survivors on the day they were declared medically clear, and the aliens were crying, and Martinez was smiling. He said this was why the council was terrified, because humans made them feel ashamed, and they held up a mirror showing what the council had become, which was a civilization so old and comfortable they forgot why civilizations exist in the first place. The council remained deeply unsettled as Velkthor prepared the next section of his presentation, and his assistant brought forward another data crystal, pulsing deep crimson, which signified classified military intelligence of the highest tier. And Velkthor explained that what he was about to show was sealed under Council Security Mandate 7 Alpha, and only 12 individuals in the entire Galactic Assembly had clearance to view this material. But now several hundred delegates would see. The council speaker asked whether this was wise, and Velkthor admitted it was not wise, but it was necessary, because if the council was going to make informed decisions about humanity's role in galactic civilization, they needed to understand what humans were truly capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. The display activated, showing a massive space station orbiting a blue supergiant star, and Velkthor identified it as Helios Station, which was humanity's most ambitious deep space construction project designed for stellar research and exotic matter collection. He explained that 7 months ago, Helios Station was conducting routine experiments when they detected an anomaly, and it was a vessel of unknown origin emerging from what appeared to be dead space, and the footage showed something vast and wrong drifting toward the station, and the ship seemed to fold space around itself with geometry that was impossible and painful to observe. Velkthor said the word that made several delegates make protective gestures, and that word was architects, and he confirmed that yes, it was them. And the architects were not members of any known galactic civilization, and they weren't even contemporaries, but something older that existed in spaces between normal reality, and most species that encountered them simply disappeared. The architect vessel was damaged and possibly fleeing something even worse, and it latched onto Helios Station like a parasite. And within minutes, the station's 800 personnel began experiencing psychological contamination. The station logs showed scientists clawing at their own eyes, and engineers trying to rebuild the station into impossible shapes and security forces turning weapons on each other while singing in languages that predated their species. Velkthor explained that standard council protocol for architect contamination was immediate sterilization, and they destroyed affected areas completely because survivors were not possible and recovery was not attempted. The human government received the containment fleet's estimated arrival time of 46 hours, and they were informed that Helios Station would be destroyed upon arrival, and all personnel were classified as lost, and the humans acknowledged the message. Then they launched every ship they had within range, and Velkthor emphasized they were not launching to evacuate, but to intervene, and the display showed a collection of military escorts and mining vessels and even a luxury cruise ship that happened to be nearby, and 18 ships total racing toward certain death. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Gary Pierce, who was 57 years old with 30 years of service, and he knew exactly what he was flying into because the council sent him every piece of data they had on architect contamination, and they explained that his crews would be infected and that rescue was impossible. Admiral Pierce's response was logged in the official record, and it said understood and going in anyway. The footage showed human crews in improvised hazard gear fighting through stations where reality itself had become unstable, and gravity reversed randomly, and walls breathed and time flowed in wrong directions. Velkthor said they went deck by deck through Helios Station, and every survivor they found was sedated immediately, and restrained and evacuated, and they welded shut sections too contaminated to enter, and they vented compartments into space, and they kept going deeper into the nightmare. One recording showed Commander Scott Williams and his team finding researchers huddled in a sealed laboratory speaking in meaningless syllables and trying to rewrite physics equations into forms that hurt to read. Williams ordered his team to get nets and sedate everyone and not listen to anything the contaminated personnel said and not look at anything they had written, and absolutely do not let them touch you. The rescue teams moved like they were fighting a war against reality itself, and each person they saved was a small victory against an incomprehensible enemy. Admiral Pierce led a team to the station's reactor core, where the architect vessel had interfaced directly and was drawing power and possibly trying to repair itself. And Pierce had an engineer named Claire Bennett with him, and she was 28 years old on her first deep space assignment. The footage showed them approaching the reactor through corridors that twisted in dimensions that shouldn't exist, and the architect vessel was visible through the walls, somehow occupying the same space as the station, but in a different layer of reality. They had one option, which was to overload the reactor manually and blow the architect vessel back into whatever dimension it came from, but someone had to stay behind to complete the sequence. Admiral Pierce didn't hesitate, and he told Bennett she was in charge, and to get everyone out, and he would buy them 30 minutes. Bennett argued and cried and finally saluted and left while the blast doors sealed behind her. The recording showed Admiral Pierce spending his final 30 minutes walking the remaining survivors toward evacuation ships, even as the architect contamination consumed him, and the log showed his condition deteriorating as he started speaking in wrong languages, and his movements became geometrically impossible, but he kept going. The last footage of Pierce showed him at the reactor, controls with his form flickering between human and something else, and his voice alternating between English and sounds that predated human speech. He said emergency override accepted and reactor cascade in 60 seconds and all ships clear the blast radius, and this is Admiral Gary Pierce of United Earth Space Command, and it's been an honor. The explosion was visible for 3 light years, and when it cleared, the architect vessel was gone, along with half of Helios Station. Velkthor said the final count was 712 survivors out of 800 personnel and 88 dead, including Admiral Pierce and 17 others who stayed behind to ensure evacuation succeeded. The Council's containment fleet arrived 36 hours later expecting to find debris and corpses, but instead they found human ships maintaining quarantine of survivors and running decontamination protocols and treating architect psychological contamination using methods they had invented in the last 2 days. The display showed Dr. Nathan Cross, who was a human neurologist, presenting his findings to shocked galactic medical teams. He explained that architect contamination rewrites neural pathways to perceive higher dimensional space. But human brains are plastic and adaptive, and they developed a treatment protocol using induced coma and neural reset procedures and targeted memory suppression, and 92% of survivors were showing complete recovery. A galactic physician had said this was impossible, and Dr. Cross had answered that yet here we are. Velkthor addressed the council directly and said that humanity encountered a force that had ended civilizations, and a threat the council responded to with immediate, scorched earth sterilization because they knew no other option, and in 46 hours humans developed a cure and executed a successful rescue operation and neutralized the threat with acceptable casualties. He pulled up comparative analysis showing that in 70 million years of galactic history, the Council had encountered architect contamination 47 times with a survival rate of 0%, but humanity's survival rate on first encounter was 89%. The chamber fell, silent as delegates absorbed this information. But Velkthor said what truly frightened him came after Helios Station, when the Council offered humans every piece of research they had on architect technology, representing millions of years of accumulated knowledge, and humans thanked them and then asked one question. The message appeared on the display asking, "Where can we find more of them?" Velkthor said humans wanted to hunt architects, and they wanted to find these reality-eating monsters, and either communicate with them or destroy them, and they were planning expeditions into dead space zones the Council had avoided for eons, and they were asking which species wanted to help. A Velnari delegate said with a shaking voice that humans were insane. Velkthor said perhaps they were insane, or perhaps they saw a threat to galactic civilization and refused to ignore it, and refused to simply hide and hope it went away. He pulled up one final document issued by the human government 3 months after Helios Station. The declaration was direct and simple, saying that humanity pledged to respond to any architect incursion anywhere in known space, and they would not abandon anyone, and they would not write anyone off as acceptable losses, and signed by the United Earth Government and allied colonies. Velkthor said they promised to protect everyone, and not just their own people but everyone, and a species barely 2 centuries into space travel was pledging to defend civilizations millions of years older than themselves. He concluded by saying the most terrifying part was that he believed them. And after Helios Station, and after everything he had seen, he believed humans would actually try, and knowing humans, they might even succeed. The council chamber had been in session for 6 hours without break, and no delegate had left because the weight of Velkthor's presentation hung over them like a physical presence that demanded their complete attention. And finally, Speaker Tresic spoke with his ancient voice carrying weariness accumulated over centuries. He said that Velkthor had shown them much about humanity's persistence and courage, and their disturbing willingness to die for others. But he reminded the historian that the presentation began by saying no species terrified him more. Yet everything shown suggested humans would be ideal allies. So why terror? Velkthor had been waiting for this question, and he pulled up a final series of files marked with the highest classification level, and he said he hadn't yet told them what humans were capable of when they were truly angry. The display shifted to show a small frontier world called New Vancouver, with a human colony population of 43,000, mostly families and researchers and agricultural specialists, and it was a peaceful world on the edge of human space. Velkthor explained that 6 weeks ago, New Vancouver was attacked by raiders, and not military forces, or even particularly organized ones, but the Kreth Syndicate, which were pirates the Council had tolerated for decades, because they were more nuisance than genuine threat. The footage showed orbital bombardment and landing craft and raiders sweeping through settlements in the colony, had minimal defenses and no military presence. The Kreth took 2,000 prisoners and mostly children, because children had value in certain illegal markets, and they broadcast demands for ransom in precious metals, or they would start executing hostages. Velkthor said the human government told the Kreth they had 48 hours to release all hostages unharmed and surrender for trial, and the Kreth laughed and killed 10 hostages to prove they were serious. The next recording showed something the Council had never witnessed, which was human military mobilization on a total war footing. Within 6 hours, humanity recalled every military vessel in active service, and they activated reserve fleets the observers didn't know existed, and they issued a declaration that froze galactic observers in shock. The message appeared on screen in multiple languages saying to the Kreth Syndicate that they had taken human children and they must return them unharmed within 36 hours or humanity would erase them from existence. And this was not a negotiation but a courtesy notice, and the clock was ticking. A delegate observed that this was harsh rhetoric, and Velkthor agreed that observers thought so too, and assumed it was empty threats from a species trying to project strength. But then the human fleet arrived at the Kreth's primary base. The footage showed 300 human warships dropping out of faster-than-light transit in perfect formation around a heavily fortified asteroid. The Kreth base had shields rated to withstand the Council's entire Fourth Fleet, and they had automated defense systems and fighter squadrons and treaties with 3 Council races that supposedly guaranteed their safety. Admiral Sarah Mitchell's voice came through the recording saying, "This is Admiral Mitchell of the UEF Valkyrie to all Kreth forces, and release the hostages now, and you have 5 minutes." The Kreth response was defiant, saying that humans were fools, and they had shields that could withstand a supernova, and they had 6,000 fighters, and they had allies, and humans had nothing that could touch them. Admiral Mitchell responded saying, 4 minutes. Velkthor paused the recording and said, "What happened next?" Violated 15 different galactic warfare conventions and introduced 17 new weapon systems. Observers didn't know humans had developed. The battle lasted 7 minutes. Total humans had developed quantum torpedoes, which were weapons that didn't travel through normal space but quantum tunneled directly through shields, and the Kreth's impenetrable defenses became completely irrelevant. The footage showed the asteroid base's shields flickering uselessly as torpedoes materialized inside the defensive perimeter and struck with devastating precision. Simultaneously, human electronic warfare ships deployed virus packages that crashed every automated system in the base, and it represented 50 years of coding expertise. Observers didn't know humans possessed, deployed in coordinated waves. The Kreth fighters launched, but they flew into walls of coordinated point defense fire. So precise it looked computer-generated, Velkthor explained. It was computer-generated because humans had developed tactical AI, specifically for combat scenarios, and not general AI which everyone had banned, but narrow combat AI that operated in microsecond timeframes. The footage showed fighter after fighter being disabled and not destroyed, but surgically taken apart with weapons fire that targeted engines and life support, while deliberately avoiding lethal hits. Velkthor said quietly that humans didn't want to kill the Kreth, but wanted them alive for trial. Within 4 minutes, the base's defenses were offline, and within 6 minutes, human boarding teams were cutting through the hull, and within 7 minutes, the battle was over. The human boarding teams moved through that base like they had trained for years, specifically for this operation, and room by room, and deck by deck, they cleared out 5,000 Kreth fighters with less than 2% casualties. The footage showed human soldiers with faces invisible behind combat helmets moving with terrifying efficiency. But what struck the Council was what happened when they found the hostages. The recording showed Staff Sergeant Linda Cruz entering a sealed cargo hold where children were being kept, and her weapons lowered immediately, and her voice filtered through the combat helmet went soft. Said, "Hey there, and I'm Cruz, and we're here to take you home, and you're safe now." There were 1,200 terrified children, and Cruz and her team spent 30 minutes talking to them and calming them before calling for medical teams. The raid teams found all 2,000 hostages, and they also found evidence of the Kreth's other operations, including slavery and genetic experimentation. And worse things, Velkthor pulled up Admiral Mitchell's after-action report, which stated that upon discovery of the full extent of Kreth operations, she authorized expansion of mission parameters, and all Kreth facilities in the sector were to be located and neutralized, and no prisoner transport would be allowed to leave, and no slave market would continue operation, and by the time they were done, the Kreth Syndicate would be a footnote in history, and humans did exactly that, and in 3 weeks, human forces dismantled an organization that had operated in Council space for 4 centuries, and they freed 38,000 slaves and shut down operations on 47 worlds. And they did it with such overwhelming force that the Kreth surrendered unconditionally. The display showed Kreth leaders in custody awaiting trial, but Velkthor said what terrified him most was what came next. The final footage showed human ships returning to New Vancouver, and children reuniting with families and medical teams treating the rescued and reconstruction beginning. He said humans could have stopped there, and could have taken their people and left, but they kept going and they freed everyone, and not just humans, but everyone's species profiles began appearing, showing Velnari and Krell and Fel and even some races the Council had never heard of, and all freed from Kreth captivity. Velkthor said, humanity fought a war of annihilation against the Kreth not because their colony was attacked, but because they found children in cages, and once they saw that, and once they understood what was happening, they couldn't unsee it. He turned to face the Council directly and said, this was why humans terrified him, because they fought wars for moral reasons, and they would mobilize their entire civilization to right wrongs that didn't directly affect them, and they couldn't ignore suffering even when it would be strategically wise to do so. He pulled up the human proposal to establish a Galactic Rescue Service, which was a joint military-humanitarian organization dedicated to responding to any crisis, anywhere in Council space, and humans would provide initial framework and training and significant force structure. Velkthor said they wanted to make what they did at Helios Station in New Vancouver and in quarantine zones standard policy, and they wanted to formalize the idea that the galaxy doesn't abandon anyone, and doesn't write off populations as acceptable losses, and remembers what it means to care about more than just your own species. Speaker Tracek asked the fundamental question of whether the Council should fear humanity. Velkthor's 6 eyes swept across the assembled delegates, and he said he had studied humanity for 30 years and watched them grow from an emerging threat to full Council members, and seen them save lives given up for lost and fight monsters the Council didn't dare face, and mourn their dead and celebrate victories with equal passion. He paused and said, yes, they should absolutely fear humans, but not because humans wanted to conquer anyone or secretly plan destruction, but because humans were going to change everything. The display showed humanity's expanding influence in species they had saved, joining their coalition and technologies. They had shared improving lives across dozens of worlds, and their radical ideas about rescue and intervention, spreading through younger civilizations. Velkthor said humans were going to make the Council question every comfortable assumption built over millions of years, and they were going to ask why the Council couldn't help and why they wouldn't try, and why they had accepted that some situations were hopeless, and they weren't going to accept the answers given. Velkthor dimmed the holographic display and let the Council absorb what they had witnessed about Commander Morrison and his crew, because understanding humanity required time to process information that seemed to contradict everything the galaxy knew about rational behavior and survival instincts, and the delegates whispered among themselves in various languages, while Velkthor's assistant brought forward another data crystal, glowing with recorded observations, spanning decades of careful study. The historian explained that after the Morrison incident, his research team had been assigned to conduct a comprehensive analysis of human behavior patterns and evolutionary history, because the Council needed to understand whether humanity represented an anomaly or a genuine threat to galactic stability. And what they discovered made Velkthor question many assumptions about how intelligent species should behave. He activated the display again, and this time it showed images of early humans on Earth hunting animals much larger and faster than themselves across vast grasslands under a burning sun. And Velkthor explained that humans were persistence hunters, which meant they were neither the strongest nor the fastest predators on their world, but they had something more dangerous than claws or venom, and that was the ability to simply never stop. The footage showed an early human following an antelope for hours across the savannah, never giving up, never losing the trail, and the animal could run faster and had more burst speed, but eventually it collapsed from exhaustion, while the human remained standing. And this hunting style was almost unique in the galaxy, because most predators relied on strength or speed or ambush tactics, but humans just kept going until their prey gave up. But persistence hunting was just the beginning, and Velkthor showed how humans applied this same relentless determination to everything they attempted, and the display shifted to show humans climbing mountains that killed many who tried, and diving to ocean depths that crushed most vessels, and venturing into frozen wastelands where nothing should survive, and burning deserts that offered no water. And they did these things not because survival required it, but because the places existed and humans wanted to see them. One delegate asked whether all species didn't explore their worlds, and Velkthor responded that exploration usually happened for resources or territorial expansion or practical necessity, but humans explored compulsively, and they had a phrase they used to justify risking death for no practical gain. And that phrase was simply because it's there, and this mindset extended to everything they attempted, from crossing oceans on wooden ships to eventually reaching for the stars. The display shifted to show human warfare across the centuries, and Velkthor's voice carried a note of something between respect and horror, as he explained that humans had been at war for 96% of their recorded history, and these were not wars of unified humanity against external threats, but wars against themselves, and they fought over resources and territory and ideas and religions and political systems, and sometimes they seemed to fight simply because they could. The footage showed battles from different eras, starting with warriors using bronze weapons and progressing through mechanized warfare and aerial bombardment, and finally to the nuclear standoffs that nearly ended their species, and several delegates made gestures of disgust or dismissal, because such constant warfare seemed barbaric and primitive. But Velkthor told them to watch more carefully, because even in their darkest moments, humans created rules for warfare, and they signed conventions about treatment of prisoners and protection of civilians and prohibition of certain weapons, and they created honor codes that limited their own effectiveness in combat because their methods offended their ethical standards, and this paradox of creating rules for killing each other was almost unique in galactic history. The display showed a field hospital in a war zone, and a human woman's voice came through, speaking calmly, despite the sounds of explosions and gunfire nearby, and she identified herself as Dr. Lisa Patterson and said she was treating wounded from both sides of the conflict and requesting that no one fire on the medical facility. And Velkthor explained that Dr. Patterson died 3 hours after that transmission from artillery fired by her own side, but before she died, she and her team saved 47 lives, including 23 enemy combatants. The council chamber grew quiet as delegates processed this information, because the idea of treating enemy wounded while your own people were dying seemed inefficient at best and insane at worst. But Velkthor explained that this behavior pattern was common among humans, and they had entire organizations dedicated to helping people regardless of which side of a conflict they belonged to. The display changed to show peaceful scenes of humans helping each other after earthquakes and floods and fires, and sharing food during famines, and building homes for strangers. And Velkthor pointed out the paradox that a species capable of systematic cruelty was equally capable of profound kindness, and they would die for complete strangers and sacrifice their well-being for abstract concepts, like justice or freedom or equality. He showed footage of a young human soldier throwing himself on a grenade to protect his squad, and the recording was brief and brutal, and the soldier had perhaps 3 seconds to make his decision. And he chose to die so 4 others could live, and Velkthor explained that humans called this heroism, and they celebrated such acts and told stories about them for generations. The statistical analysis appeared on the display, showing thousands of similar incidents across human history, and Velkthor explained that his research team had run simulations to predict what would happen if humanity ever unified and turned their attention outward to the galaxy, and every simulation ended the same way, with human vessels spreading across space like a geometric progression, adapting and learning and growing at rates that seemed impossible. The projections showed human territory expanding not through military conquest, but through a combination of exploration and trade and cultural exchange, and most disturbingly through a tendency to help other species, even when doing so provided no immediate benefit. And Velkthor explained that humans seemed to operate on emotional imperatives that overrode pure survival logic. A new recording began playing, and it showed a human woman named Captain Nicole Grant commanding a vessel that had suffered catastrophic damage, and she calmly explained that they had lost containment on their antimatter systems and estimated 7 minutes until cascade failure, and she ordered evacuation of all non-essential personnel. The recording continued with 30 seconds of silence before Captain Grant spoke again and said she would stay behind to maintain reactor stability, because someone had to, or the blast would destroy the entire evacuation convoy. And she told someone to tell her son she loved him, and that she bought them time to make it home. Velkthor paused the recording and explained that Captain Grant had a 93% chance of survival if she evacuated immediately, but she chose certain death to buy 8 additional minutes for her crew, and all 217 personnel survived because of her sacrifice. The display showed file after file of similar incidents, and Velkthor explained that these were just examples from the past 70 years, and a complete list would take days to review, and the pattern was clear that humans routinely sacrificed themselves for others, in ways that made no logical sense from a pure survival perspective. But the moment that truly made Velkthor understand the threat humanity posed came during one of their civil conflicts, and the image showed a small child, perhaps 6 years old, standing before an armored soldier pointing a weapon at her, and the child was offering the soldier a flower. The next image showed the soldier on his knees with his weapon discarded, and tears running down his face. And Velkthor explained that the soldier had orders to clear that street by any means necessary, and his faction had committed documented atrocities. But this single moment with a child offering a flower made him defect. The child's name was Sophie Martin, and she died 3 weeks later from disease, but her actions sparked a cascade that ended a 6-year war. And Velkthor said this demonstrated something terrifying about humanity, and that was their ability to change hearts and minds through simple acts of kindness or courage. Turned to face the council directly, and said that humans were weapons that didn't know they were weapons, and they were vectors of change, who transformed everything they touched, and they were survivors who thrived in conditions that would break any other species, and most terrifying of all, they didn't believe they were special or unique. The display showed modern Earth with cities of glass and steel and ships departing for distant stars and children playing in parks, and Velkthor said, humanity was entering the galactic stage with quantum communication and ships that rivaled council vessels in speed, and they were making contact with neighboring species, who kept asking the same questions about why humans acted the way they did. Velkthor's voice dropped low as he concluded this section, and he said he still wasn't certain anyone truly understood humanity. But the data showed one clear pattern, and that was, if humanity ever perceived a genuine threat to their survival, they wouldn't surrender, and they wouldn't negotiate, and they would fight with a ferocity that made ancient warrior races look cautious, and they would never stop.